Welcome to my series of video tutorials on how to prepare Form 990-EZ information return for small tax-exempt organizations. I'm David McCree. I'm a CPA, and you can find me on the web at myform990ez.com. Today we're going to talk about the expenses section on page 1 of Form 990-EZ, and I just want to remind you quickly that what I'm telling you here is not intended to replace the instructions for the form. I can't include every detail. What I'm trying to do is to just give you a basic working knowledge and maybe give you a few tips and tricks that may not be in the form instructions. So if you'll look here between line 10 and line 17, this is the section where you're going to identify your expenses. You're going to list all your expenses. Now, just to show you, to contrast the difference between the 990-EZ and the full Form 990, this is the expense page on the full Form 990, and as you can see, it takes up the entire page, and it is split up into total expenses, program service expenses, management and general or administrative expenses, and then fundraising expenses. So this is not present on the Form 990-EZ, as you can see. Okay, so let's get started with line 10, grants and similar amounts paid, and you need to there is a requirement that some of these need to be listed in Schedule O. So what you put on line 10 would be grants paid to other organizations or to individuals. So if you're making a grant to another nonprofit organization, for instance, to help them with their program, which might be similar to yours, that would go there. Scholarships paid to individuals or to colleges would go here for the benefit of an individual. If you paid a service provider, let's say you paid a doctor to treat an indigent person, okay, that payment would go here because it's a grant for the benefit of a person. Also, any payments or grants to affiliates, like for instance, if you're a local organization and you have a state or a national organization that you remit some dues payment to every year or some sort of an annual payment, that would go here. You do not put on line 10 any sort of dues paid to unrelated organizations. Say if you're a member of some sort of professional association or whatever, that would not go here. That would go down on line 16 and other expenses. So it mentioned earlier that some of the grants need to be itemized on Schedule O. So basically, if you have given a grant to an organization or an individual, and that grant was more than $5,000 to that particular organization or individual, that needs to go on Schedule O. It needs to be listed. And you're going to put the class of activity, which would be not just educational or religious, but you would need to tell what it was for. For instance, it was for prescription drugs or medical expenses, or to put somebody up in a homeless shelter or something like that. You need to put the name and the address of the donee organization, the organization that's receiving the funds, and the amount given. For individuals, you don't want to list their name and address. You would just say grant to an individual, and then it would be important that if that individual is related to one of your officers or directors, or if it's related to a contributor, then you would need to disclose that relationship on there, on the Schedule O. So for instance, let's say you had a contributor who maybe one of their relatives was in a bad situation and they wanted to contribute $1,000 to their relative to help them pay their rent. So they might say, well, I'd like to get a charitable deduction for that. So they go to a local charity and they say, hey, I want to make a donation to you for $1,000, but I want you to give it to my cousin because he's was a victim of a crime or he's been sick and hasn't been able to pay his rent. so I want you to, this money is to give to him. Well, I mean, you can do that, but you can't take a deduction for it. Okay, and that's why the IRS wants you to disclose the relationship between the organization or its directors or a contributor and the individual person who's receiving the benefit, because they're looking for that. This is what you call private benefit. Okay, and private benefit can be problematic. So that's what they're fishing for here. Here's an example of grants reported on Schedule O. So this would relate to line 10. And you can see what I've done is I've just labeled it so the IRS or anyone else reading it can understand that this pertains to Form 99EZ, line 10, grants and similar amounts paid. And remember, this is just for grants that are $5,000 or more. And my first one here is a cash grant paid to the Bay Area Homeless Shelter. I list the address and I say what it's for. It's to buy new furniture. And the amount of the grant was $10,000. The next one I listed was a payment to Bayside Medical. I list the address, and it's for drug rehabilitation treatment of an indigent person. No relationship. In other words, the indigent person is not related to anyone in the organization or to a contributor, and the amount was $6,250. There's no specific format that you have to use to put it on here. This is just an example of what would be acceptable. Line 11, benefits paid to or for members. Usually this line's only going to be used if you're a fraternal organization or an employee beneficiary organization, like a 501c8, a 501c9, or 501c17. And that would be organizations like that provide insurance or death benefits, hospitalization, disability benefits, or something like that to their members. This, you would not put employment benefits on this line, like health insurance for employees. That would not go here on line 11. That would go on line 12. Okay, line 11, they're looking for benefits paid to or for members of the organization. Now, if you're a membership organization like a 501c4 or C5 or C6 or C7, you got to be careful because benefits paid to members could indicate the existence of impermissible private benefits. Okay, so you want to be careful with that. Line 12, salaries, other compensation, and employee benefits. This is where you're going to show the salaries and wages that you pay to employees, to officers and directors and trustees, whether or not it's reported on a W-2 or whether it's reported on a 1099 miscellaneous form. Okay, you're going to include retirement plan contributions, the employer's share, health insurance premiums paid by the employer, payroll taxes, which includes the employer's share of Social Security. And so this is a good point to remind you that if you're a small organization, and if you're paying an officer or director, say, $1,000 or something like that for the year to come to director meetings and to offset their expenses and give them some incentive to participate, that's going to be reported on a 1099 miscellaneous. But if your executive director or your founder or whoever, a key employee in your organization, if they are being paid for not being a director, but as a manager or for providing services to the organization as a manager type employee, this is an employee and needs to be reported on, their earnings need to be reported on Form W-2 and payroll tax returns filed. A lot of small organizations make this mistake, and sometimes that catches up with you. Another thing that I thought was interesting in the IRS instructions, it says that employee events, for instance, an employee picnic or a holiday party or something like that, that would also, those expenses would also be reported on line 12. So I don't think I've ever seen that in a small nonprofit, but I suppose it could happen. Line 13, professional fees and other payments to independent contractors. So this is where if you're paying a lawyer for providing legal services, for your organization, for accounting, auditing, tax return preparation, investment advice, If you're paying a professional fundraiser or some sort of a consultant, that would go on line 13. And these types of payments generally also would be reported at the end of the year on a Form 1099 miscellaneous, subject to those rules. If you have a contractor, an independent contractor, maybe an attorney or something, and you're reimbursing them for some expense, okay, and if their itemized bill breaks out those expenses, then you need to report the expenses down on lines either 14, 15, or 16, depending on where they belong. As an example, let's say your attorney passes along some overnight document shipping charges to you and bills you separately for that. Okay, that would not go on line 13. That would go down on line 15 under postage and shipping, if you're able to break that out. Okay, and that's in an ideal world. Line 14, occupancy, rent, utilities, and maintenance. Boy, they really lump a lot into this. These would be expenses for the use of office space. It would include, property that's actually occupied by the organization. So, for instance, the administrative offices, or maybe even offices where you meet with clients, as well as any facilities that might be used in exempt functions. So, let's say, for instance, you had a domestic abuse shelter or a homeless shelter or something like that, a clinic where people came. That would also be included on line 14. Also, if there's any depreciation associated with those facilities, it would also go on line 14. Line 15, printing, publications, postage, and shipping. What you frequently find here are expenses related to newsletters or promotional videos, pamphlets, programs, and also if your organization subscribes to any publications or it purchases any types of publications, that also would go here. Line 16, other expenses. Well, anything that doesn't go on lines 10 through 15 is basically going to go on line 16. It could be depreciation related to, a printer or computer, insurance, interest, travel expenses, conferences, meetings, that sort of thing. So now let's look at sort of a typical way that a small organization might show its expenses on an Excel spreadsheet or something that they would give to me to prepare their return. And I see this regularly, and so I've just put a little hypothetical expense schedule here. So we see grants, salaries, professional fees, occupancy, and then they've just, let's say this organization has two programs, okay? They have an educational program and then they have a homeless shelter. And their educational program expenses, they just lump it all into this one big category here, and same thing with their homeless shelter expenses. Okay, so typically they would fill in grants, salaries, professional fees, and occupancy on the correct lines on the Form 990EZ. But then down in other expenses, they would just lump everything else into the functional category of educational program and homeless shelter. I have never really seen the IRS make a fuss about that, but it's not the right way to do it. It's not the way it's supposed to be done. And let me show you, the same thing the way it really should be done. And this is the way it really should look. So instead of just showing the program expenses as line items, you actually break out, insurance, travel, conferences, and depreciation. These would go under other expenses. And then across, we have it broken out into educational program expenses, homeless shelter expenses, administrative expenses, and fundraising expenses. And then you can see your totals here. Okay? So this is what you call a statement of functional expenses. And if you're using something like Quicken or QuickBooks, you're going to need not only categories here, but you're probably going to also, you're going to have to use classes to divide it up into these different functions. So the advantage here is that you can see all your educational program expenses right here. This is your total, your homeless shelter totals, your administrative totals, and your fundraising totals. And we'll see later why it can be a good idea to do this. Now, if you only have one program, this really isn't necessary. Okay, if you just have one program, this would be okay. Although it would be better to just go ahead and itemize. Let's say you only had an educational program, you didn't have the homeless shelter. So instead of just saying educational program expenses $17,000, you could just itemize what those expenses are. Okay. But if you have more than one program, this really is the way to go with this type of a thing, this type of a statement of functional expenses. So I hope that has been helpful to you. Even though the expense section on the Form 990EZ seems small and simple, to really do it correctly, it's a little more complicated than it looks. Again, what I'm telling you is in a perfect world, and if you're a tiny nonprofit, you don't have a lot of expertise, you don't have a lot of time, you don't have a lot of resources, you're a volunteer, don't freak out if you cannot meet all the requirements. Okay? You do the best you can and try to disclose as much as you reasonably can. Follow the form instructions and you should be just fine. Thanks for watching my video tutorial. If you need more help, you can find me on the web at myform990ez.com.